أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ربي اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي الحمد لله رب العالمين ثم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين أما بعد فقد قال الله تعالى في كتابه المجيد وفرقانه الحميد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ولو شاء الله لجعلكم أمة واحدة ولكن ليبلوكم فيما آتاكم فاستبقوا الخيرات إلى الله مرجعكم جميعا فينبئكم بما كنتم فيه تختلفون آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد أعظم الله أجورنا وأجوركم بمصابنا الحسين عليه السلام. Respected elders, brothers and sisters, may Allah increase in our reward for the commemorations of the Shahadat of Aba Abdullah. Our continuing discussion over these 12 nights is on the topic of keeping alive the spirit of Islam. And as we discussed yesterday as well, that much of the facilitation that we have from our community and our society has been restricted in these days, which is why the individual effort is increased. And I'm sure each of us is feeling this now, that this year, for us to preserve the message of Karbala, to continue the aza of Aba Abdullah, to continue to work on our faith, we're having to exert much more effort. Remember something, any time and any effort that you exert, anything that you perform, Allah rewards every action. لا أضيء عمل عامل من ذكر أو أنثى. Allah Himself says, I don't waste any effort of any man or any woman. Every effort that you exert, anything that you exert in the way of Allah is something that Allah rewards. Any difficulty you go through, any problem that you face, Allah rewards. The only caveat and condition to this is to ensure that the efforts that we exert, the intentions that we have, are for the sake of Allah. You see, sometimes it happens that a person is doing good, but for example, they're doing good to get married. They're thinking to themselves, oh, I want a good spouse, so let me behave in a way that will attract a good spouse. Someone is doing good for position in society, in politics and environment. I'm a humanitarian, but with the interest of attaining politics. Someone goes out and becomes a warrior and fights in the way of Islam, for example, but with the intention that people should acknowledge me and reward me. Someone goes out and becomes a scholar of Islam with the intention that people should appreciate me and follow me. All of these actions, though good, though involving great juhud and striving, are absent of one of the strongest and the only fundamental that is required: for the sake of Allah. It's stated on the Day of Judgment that the martyr will come and will come to Allah for reward, the shaheed, and he will say to Allah, Ya Allah, I gave my life in your way. Now reward me with heaven. And Allah will say, you didn't give your life away for me. You did it so that people would consider you brave and appreciate you. And they did. And your reward is with them and not with me. The scholar will come and say, I lived my life in deprivation without any of the wealth and the comforts of society. I sacrificed all of these things for your sake, O Allah. And Allah will reply to him, no, you made those sacrifices so that people would follow you and appreciate you. And they did. Your reward is with them, not with me. One of the strong fundamentals of keeping alive the spirit of Islam is this idea of qasd al-qurba, the intention of attaining proximity to Allah, the niyat that we maintain through each of these actions. Many times it happens that as we proceed down a path, we find conflict and we wonder to ourselves, why am I doing this? People aren't appreciating me. People take advantage of me. There's no appreciation for all of this work that I'm doing. That is where Shaitan is trying to attack. He's questioning and putting your intention into doubt. That are you doing it for the sake of Allah, or are you doing it for the sake of people to appreciate you? Are you doing it so that Allah loves you or so that people acknowledge you? Never expect any to return or response from society. As a matter of fact, we want no one to appreciate us if it means that Allah appreciates us more. We don't want anyone to reward us if it means that the reward with Allah is greater. That's why every prophet called out, "La as'alukum alayhi ajran. In ajri ilallah." I don't want any reward from you, O people, for the message that I brought you. I don't want any appreciation or acknowledgement from you. I want the appreciation and acknowledgement from Allah and not from anyone else. This becomes a very important factor, a really important element that we have to maintain in our lives. Is that to keep alive the spirit of Islam, we work and we work very hard, and we face many trials and tribulations, khususan in these days, where we can't use the benefit of our community. We can't use the benefit of our Husseiniya and our center that we invested in. We can't use the benefit of our collective, of all of us looking after one another. There is much more work. It is thankless. But I don't do it so that people appreciate me. I do it so that Allah appreciates me. I do it so that my connection with Allah is deepened. And the acknowledgement and the appreciation comes from Allah. And the same way that the Anbiya said to the people, don't give me anything for this. We say the same thing. I don't want anything from society. I only want from Allah. And inshallah, may Allah accept all of our amal in these days. Our topic at hand today is the discussion around the difference between culture and faith. In the verse of the Quran that we're beginning our discussion with, we see that in Surah Ma'idah, verse number 48, as a part of the verse, Allah makes a statement, وَلَوْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ لَجَعَلَكُمْ أُمَّةً وَاحِدَةً. Allah is saying that if I had wanted, I could have made you one nation, one group of people. وَلَكِنْ لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ فِيمَا آتَاكُمْ. But Allah wanted to test you with that which He has given you, so He made you into different nations and different tribes. And then Allah continues, فَاسْتَبِقُوا الْخَيْرَاتِ. Then vie with each other and exceed one another in doing good deeds. إِلَى اللَّهِ مَرْجِعُكُمْ. And to Allah is your eventual return, جَمِيعًا, all of you. فَيُنَبِّئُكُمْ بِمَا كُنْتُمْ فِيهِ تَخْتَلِفُونَ. And then Allah will explain to you and will announce to you and will clarify for you all those matters in which you used to differ. The differences in cultures and society and the differences between nations and tribes is something Allah has put amongst society so that they may understand and recognize one another and build relationships with one another and connections and identity. Very famously, Surah Hujurat discusses this as well too. Ya ayyuhan nas inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شَعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا. That, O mankind, certainly we created from you men and women and from clans and tribes so that you may know one another. That the purpose of this different cultures and identities was for familiarity, identity, differentiation, and having a unique presence among society. And then Allah continues, Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum. That certainly the closest to Allah, the nearest to Allah from amongst you, is the one who is atqakum, the one who is the most pious from among you. This implication of piety being a preferential characteristic of a relationship with Allah puts a question into the minds and hearts of some people that is culture in general something that conflicts with faith? Is culture something that is a bad thing? This concept of culture, right? Because it has no relationship or value in attaching us closer or further from Allah. So should we ignore and throw away culture entirely and only focus on the relationship with Allah? Because piety is the only measure. Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum. And Allah is saying that the making of you into different tribes and nations, liyabluwakum fima atakum. This is just the process of creating a test amongst the people that are present. So the first thing we take a look at, inshallah, our conversation is split into 3 sections today. 1 is taking a look at, is culture in conflict with faith? 2 is looking at the allowance of culture and the allowance of the culture we live in to impact our children. And the third area we'll take a look at today is, what's the benefit? Is there a benefit of preserving the culture of our forefathers? And in these 3 sections, inshallah, we'll conclude our discussion for the day. The first section we take a look at is culture in conflict with faith. The first thing we take a look at is, what exactly is culture? Right? The definition of culture is necessary to understand, what am I saying? Is what am I questioning? Faith and Iman, we know, is the ideology upon which a person's lifestyle and belief system is based upon. The acknowledgement of a higher power, or a system of belief and system of knowing that which exists outside of the boundary of man's individual capabilities and capacities, and using that as a system of guidance for a lifestyle. This is faith. Culture refers to those customs, arts, social institutions, and achievements of a people or social group. It includes nation in the definition, or of a nation many times, but a nation is nothing more than a large social group. Because at the end of the day, Allah didn't create the world with boundaries. We established boundaries. So we established nations, and therefore those are just simply large social groups. But the idea that a culture is a series of customs and social institutions and achievements and behaviors and lifestyles that recognize and uniquely identify a group of people. And the question is this something that conflicts with the faith of Islam? To understand this question and to really look at this question, the best way to establish the precedent for this question and answering this question is by looking at the life and the example of our Holy Prophet Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. As the originator and the initial example and the perfect example of living a life the way Allah wants on this earth. There's no one better to teach us about the acceptability of culture than our Holy Prophet. There's no one else that we want to use as a reference point to understand the Islamic perspective about culture than going back to the source of Islam, the teacher of Islam, the most perfect example in humanity, the one who is known as Rahmatun lil Alameen, the mercy to all the world, to mankind, our Holy Prophet. When we look at the life of our Holy Prophet, we see his establishment of the religion of Islam took a period of 23 years. 13 of those years were spent with him existing in a minority, existing within a culture that was not reflective of the values and faith of Islam, and 10 years of teaching and establishment of the fiqh and the lifestyle of Islam amongst the society. As we take a look at this, we see many examples of how culture was involved with the establishment of Islam. One of the key places that we take a look at of this culture and this relationship of Islam is those things that existed before the advent of Islam and how they existed once Islam was established within the community and society. To that end, we have, when we look at, for example, one of the key and main areas of existence of culture pre-Islam and during Islam as an example to see what its role was the experience of Hajj. Hajj is something that existed before Islam and was a part of the culture of Arabia, and something that continued on after the establishment of Islam. Simply the existence of this event before Islam and after Islam gives us an indication that Islam didn't eradicate the culture that existed before. So meaning this was a sign that Rasulullah allowed the culture to exist, and it continued to exist as Islam went on. Rather, what we take a look at and we see is that even for the early Muslims who lived amongst the mushrikeen, And the Muslims of Medina, as they established the religion of Islam, there was nothing that forced them, and Rasulullah never told them that they can't have relationships or connections or they must completely readopt their lifestyle that existed before Islam to reflect Islam. But instead, what we saw is that culture was something that Rasulullah went through the process of modifying to fit Islamic values. For example, the Hajj. Hajj in pre-Islamic times was something that the mushrikeen performed, the munafiqeen, everyone was able to perform. However, its process by which it was performed was somewhat different, including, na'uzubillah, that those who used to perform the Hajj naked, and they would go around the Kaaba and do tawaf without clothing. There were, for example, there was a tree at the outskirts of Mecca that was seen as a place where people would first take blessing and then go to Hajj. These examples of things that existed and predated Islam, when Rasulullah established the Hajj as a practice of Muslimin, he didn't wipe out and eradicate the Hajj in its entirety, but rather he removed certain aspects of it that weren't reflective of the values of Islam. In this, we saw that the culture can persist, but the facets of culture that disagree with Islam have to be removed. To this end, we even see in the example of Hajj, when we look further into the example of Hajj, we see that Rasulullah established the concept of Hajj, allowed the process of Hajj to continue, but he himself, as long as these mushrikeen and these people, these polytheists were performing Hajj, Rasulullah himself did not lead the Hajj. Rasulullah, in the year 9 after Hijrah, Rasulullah sends Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam with Surah Al-Tawbah, with Surah Al-Bara'ah, to read it to the people of Mecca, which was one of the superiorities of Ali ibn Abi Talib and is one of the beautiful facets of history. That in that year, Abu Bakr was sent with 300 of the Hujjaj from the city of Medina to lead the Hajj. And had that been enough, this would have been considered one of the great honors of Abu Bakr, that he led the Hajj for 300 people, that he was the delegate of the Prophet sent with 300 people of Hajj, and it would have been something that people announced with great status, that the first Khalifa, yes, he's the one who led the Hajj. But look at how Allah then shows where superiority lies. With the revelation of Surah At-Tawbah, Rasulullah is given instruction, have this announced and read amongst the people of Mecca. But not anyone can recite this, only someone, either yourself, Ya Rasulullah, or someone who is from you. And in this case, Rasulullah hands the surah of Tawbah to Amir al-Mu'mineen, says, "Oh Ali, you are from me, go and recite this amongst the people of Makkah." And Amir al-Mu'mineen is then sent to the event of Hajj to then go and recite this to the people. And the superiority of Ali ibn Abi Talib is established, that Ali ibn Abi Talib is from Rasulullah if he is not Rasulullah himself. And the fada'il of one leading the Hajj completely dissipated and was lost in history, because the superiority of one who is a part of Rasulullah was revealed through the revelation of Surah At-Tawbah. In year 9, Amir al-Mu'mineen comes and recites Surah Tawbah to the people, and in this, the munafiqeen, the mushrikeen, those who are the polytheists, are forbidden from performing the Hajj anymore and are told that they must leave the precincts of the Kaaba and the environment altogether. Once the Kaaba in year 9 at the event of Hajj is cleared of all of the polytheists, year 10 now Rasulullah comes to lead the Hajj. And in this year, when leading the Hajj, over 100,000 Muslimin from all over Arabia and the Muslim lands come to attend the Hajj to learn the process of the Hajj as Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, himself performed it. In this way, Rasulullah separated his example of Hajj and taught society about Hajj in the absence of the culture of mushrikeen. Now, had the mushrikeen been allowed to be present in the precincts of the Kaaba at the time of the Hajj of Rasulullah, there would have been confusion amongst the people that either one of two things would have happened. That while Rasulullah was performing Hajj, that either the mushrikeen would perform Hajj and their example of Hajj would be acceptable for all of the Muslimin to perform as well. Or the other thing that might have happened is that as Rasulullah was establishing the example of Hajj, he would have then had to exclude or to remove the mushrikeen or prevent the mushrikeen from performing the Hajj the way they wanted to, so that the example of Rasulullah could be established amongst the people. But rather, in the process of correcting this culture, Rasulullah first went through the process of making sure that the example of the mushrikeen was removed. And then in the next year, when he led the Hajj, he established and confirmed the true message of Hajj and process of Hajj for people. And here he clarified the example of the culture that existed before and how it should exist now. Other examples that we see, for example, is where people came with their culture and wanted to have their culture included into the religion of Islam, or to adapt the religion of Islam so that it would reflect their values and how Rasulullah dealt with them. For example, one tribe came and they said that we have been worshipping Lat for a long time. One of the idols, whose name was Lat, they said, "Oh Rasulullah, allow us then to keep our idol and we'll become Muslimin." And Rasulullah said, "No." They said, "Let us keep it for 2 years. Let us keep worshipping Lat as well as Islam. And then we'll, eventually switch over." Rasulullah said, "No." Then they continued further and they said, "How about for 1 year?" Rasulullah insisted on no. Then they said for 6 months, for 2 months, for 1 month, until eventually they came to the conclusion that the culture of Islam mandated that for these people to be accepted into Islam, this part of their culture had to be completely removed. Another group of people came and they said that we want to be Muslim, we'll accept your Islam, but this thing of salat that you've added here, how about for a few years you give us a break from prayer and we'll become Muslimin, we'll follow this religion, but for a few years we need off from this. And Rasulullah disagreed and said that that's not possible. If you wish to be Muslimin, you have to accept it with all of its conditions, including the additions to your culture. So what we saw was that culture was allowed to exist within Islam and was accepted into Islam. However, where there were aspects of this culture that disagreed with Islam, Rasulullah insisted on removing or changing them. The same is true with the conquest of Mecca, where at the time of the conquest of Mecca, that each of the households were insisted of the Quraysh that any idol you keep in your house must now be removed. Rasulullah did not come out and say that from now on your culture is void and changed and forever forgotten. No, he said this element is something that stands against the authority of Allah, therefore remove it. The lifestyle, the style of Muslimin living with non-Muslimin was similar. But there were certain elements that had to be removed, which Rasulullah insisted upon before it was that they would be eligible to accept this process into becoming Muslimin. Each of these becomes a lesson and indication for us in the process of how the culture that pre-existed Islam was allowed to exist with Islam, and that there's no conflict between these two concepts as long as the laws of Islam are continued to be kept in guidelines and that they are the restriction. Another point that we take a look at to understand how it was that the concept of Islam insisted on shifting the culture, not removing the culture, is the verse that discusses hijab. In Surah Al-Mu'minun, Surah Al-Nur, the 24th surah of the Holy Quran, verses 30 and 31 are seen as the verses that give an explanation of hijab. And khususan, while this discussion around hijab is very lengthy, we'll mention very briefly, right? Where Allah says in verse number 31, He says, وَلَيَضْرِبْنَا بِخُمُرِهِنَّ عَلَى جُيُوبِهِنَّ. That Allah gives the explanation, and this is the explanation that brings about the presence of hijab within Islam. And that وَلَيَضْرِبْنَا بِخُمُرِهِنَّ عَلَى جُيُوبِهِنَّ, that they should lower their khumar, their khimar, over their necks, over their collarbones. The kalimat that are used in this sentence, while they don't use the word hijab as it is understood today, Allah says that they should lower or they should drop their khimar over their collarbones. This statement of khimar is not a word that was unique to the Muslimin, but rather was a cultural concept present in the society before the advent of Islam. A khimar in pre-Islamic times was something that was already used that women wore to cover their hair. And Islam said, take this covering of your hair, this khimar, and now lower it so that it covers your collarbones. Now, there are a couple of interesting points here. One is the concept of hijab, according to Islam, is not simply the covering of the hair, but rather it's the covering and the modesty, which is described throughout the entire verse, but that as a part of the covering of the hair, that the covering of the hair should be continued until even this area here and the collarbones are covered as well too. In contemporary times, one of the things that we've seen is a reversion to the concept of khimar, where, for example, people in the concept of hijab are just covering their hair and that the neck and the collarbones are open again. And Islam insisted that no, that has to be covered. And that the hijab is something that is not complete until even this area is covered. And the only areas that are uncovered is that part of the face that should be washed for wudu. And anything in excess of that should be covered. The other concept that we take a look at is the impact of culture. That the culture that pre-existed Islam, instead of Islam replacing it entirely, Islam modified it so that it would reflect the values of the Islamic faith, so that your iman was something that could be preserved with your culture. So therefore modify your culture in a way so that it aligns with Islam. In here, there's an interesting side discussion that we'll stop for a minute and we'll make, as about the concept of hijab, and this is a lengthy conversation, but very briefly. And is the concept of hijab a cultural item within the cultures of Islam? And many times one of the arguments that happens is that this is a repressive system that pre-existed Islam that now just continued to persist as Islam went on, because that was something the Arab used to do. This verse of the Quran teaches us very clearly that what the Arab used to do before Islam was something that as it existed does not conform with Islam and it needed to be changed. Therefore, the Islamic concept of hijab is something unique that required the people of the time to change their culture, and it isn't reflective of the culture that existed before. Two, the concept of hijab isn't something that is just a culture. Rather, it has a social benefit and it has a responsibility for its existence and a purpose of its existence. And this is where, for example, sometimes we fall short because we don't know how to properly vocalize what it is that hijab accomplishes in society. Hijab is the equalizer of the participants of society. Hijab is that process by which the ornamentation of women is removed from the equation of their movement in community and society. You see, Allah has made women where everything from their head to their feet is beauty and zinat and ornamentation. And Allah said that when you enter into a society, when you come into a community, cover and remove this beauty from the equation of your dealing with people that do not have a relationship of mahramiyat with you. What does that mean? That means that your ornamentation, your beauty, is something that can unduly influence an individual of how they deal with you. So Allah says, remove that so that when someone speaks to you, that your beauty is not something that influences that conversation. Hijab allows a woman to enter into society, to interact in the community, to go and perform transactions in society, to purchase in the market, to sell in the market, without her age, her appearance affecting how people interact and deal with her. This is the true purpose of hijab, to create equality in interaction, that I can't choose that, for example, based upon the appearance of a woman or how she looks, that I treat her differently than I treat other people that come into the marketplace. That I have unfair preferences to one over the other. No, by removing the ornament, the only thing that I have to focus on is the content of the conversation and communication that I have with a woman. That all of these other facets and features of her are removed from the equation. This was the intention of Islam. It was not to repress and remove women from the communication of society, presence of society, but rather to give them presence that would remove the artificial effects that people could utilize instead of just the words that they have to say and the content of their character. Just as an aside, these aspects and these conversations laid the fundamental that culture is not in conflict with faith in its entirety, but rather that culture may at times need to be modified so that it fits within the boundaries of Islam. If we were to describe Islam in its relationship with culture, is that, for example, when you have a highway or a road with many lanes in it, all of these lanes leading in one direction are the path of Islam. And each of the lanes within this highway are the various cultural means that people can use to get towards Islam. As long as that lane continues to head in the direction that I want to head in, there's no problem with me traveling in it. There's no problem with me utilizing that culture. But if that lane was to turn away from my end goal, then I would say that I need to change this lane and to move into another lane so that I can continue on to the direction that I want to achieve. Culture as it exists is not in conflict with Islam, and we even see that, for example, in the culture of how India and Pakistan and their culture of being Muslimin and Islam and following Islam exists and has the permission to exist within the boundaries of Islam. You see, historically, the establishment of Islam in the subcontinent, and we'll call it India because up until the 1940s, it was just India. In the time of the advent of Islam, it was known as one land. Islam has been in the subcontinent either from the time of Rasulullah, and some will narrate that at the time of Rasulullah, people had even traversed to India to establish Islam, and Islam had come there, or at least the documented history of Islam is within 50 years after the Shahadat of Rasulullah, that Islam was within India, was within these lands. And the presence of the cultural aspects of Islam are shown within Indian culture, and the aspects of Indian culture are shown within Islam. Marhum Sayyid Akhtar Rizvi, in one of his discussions about this topic, gives an example of this too. He says that in Islam, in the Islamic architectural style, was the concept of the minaret and the dome, and how domes and minarets came to India because of the influence of Islamic culture and the acceptance of Islamic culture into the Indian subcontinent. And that conversely, the lotus is something that is significant in the Indian culture and is demonstrated through many pieces of Indian architecture and art that show the lotus. And he points to the coming together of these two in the example of, that he says, the finest example of marble art that exists in the world, the Taj Mahal. And he says the dome of the Taj Mahal, if it's paid attention to closely, is an inverted lotus that is used as the dome. And he says this is the coming together of these two cultures into one, and that in this there's no problem with it, and that there's no conflict with it. So the establishment of culture and the utilization and the cross moving up from culture to Islam, and that people accept Islam, there's never been a conflict with it, and that culture within itself is not something that we say is in conflict with Islam, but rather there can be elements of a culture, processes of, for example, worship, which was the idols that needed to be changed, processes of activities, for example, the Hajj, that needed to be changed to reflect the values of Islam, processes of dress that needed to be adapted to fit the rules of Islam, as was the example with the khimar in the pre-existing times of Arabia. All of these coming together, we start to understand that any culture that exists, it's possible for the people of that culture to continue to live their lives in their culture and be Muslimin. Otherwise, what we would find is that Islam was restricted to a certain people and a certain culture and not to all of humanity. Had that been the case, our Prophet would not have been Rahmatul lil Alameen. He would have been Rahmatul lil Alam. If there were cultures that could not live their lifestyle as Muslimin, then they would not have been people who were available or open to receiving the mercy of Allah. but rather we see that the mercy of Allah is such that it's open to all people, all nations, all tribes, and that it's acceptable for all people. Which opens us up to our second question then. Is there a problem? Should we allow our children to adopt the American culture? Now, when many many Muslimin that live in this country are those who migrated to this country, and their migration was to improve the quality of life or to get access to resources or to save themselves from persecution in their own lands. Therefore, they migrated to this country. The migration to this country was also then in the interest of taking advantage of the resources that are in this country, the education system, the job opportunities, the religious freedom, the freedom of speech. Each of these benefits that we came to take advantage of come with the culture of the land and the environment. Some of these aspects of culture we appreciate and we enjoy. For example, one of the key areas of difference between this culture and the cultures of the subcontinent and the Middle East is the system of education. And there's a culture of education. Whereas, for example, in Middle Eastern countries, or for example, Far Eastern countries, or almost the entire Eastern Hemisphere, is the concept that education is done through a system of promoting memorization, to learn and to repeat. And the better that you are at memorizing, the better of a student you are. The Western system of education, which adapted and moved beyond the system of memorization, changed its focus that our students shouldn't be one that can necessarily repeat to us verbatim the words of the author who taught them, but rather that the concept and philosophy behind the words is significant and more significant that a student should know. What this did was this ensured that students who study in these institutions know and understand the concepts and philosophy and how to apply them in their day-to-day life, as opposed to simply being able to regurgitate and repeat the wording of an author or the philosophy as it was presented. This system of education is something that is better, that it gives the student more of an ability to understand and apply in his life the knowledge that he gains through a process of education. And in liking this, we want our children to adopt and take advantage of this system of education. This we see as one of the benefits that we can receive from this culture. And there are many benefits within the culture as it exists that we can benefit from. However, the same rules that applied to the culture of Arabia at the time of the advent of Rasulullah that needed to be adapted to ensure that they were in line with the philosophy and faith of Islam, the same is true of the culture of the country that we live in, that within it exist elements that are in conflict with Islam or that don't give us the full benefit of Islam, that we want to make sure that we acknowledge and we prepare for. The best way that I have to explain this to you is a hadith that we have from our sixth Imam, Ja'far ibn Muhammad as-Sadiq alayhi salam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Al-mu'minu hasan al-ma'unati wa khafif al-ma'unati wa jayyid al-tadbir al-ma'ishatihi wa la yalsa'u min juhr al-marratin. This hadith of our sixth Imam describes the character and describes the attributes of a believer. Imam says, he says, a believer is one, hasan al-ma'unati, who has good expectation of his assistance and his abilities, that he is someone who applies his efforts well and fairly, provides valuable assistance. Second, wa khafif al-ma'una, a mu'min is someone who has khafif al-ma'una, has low expenses, has less desire for this world and less interest in purchasing and amassing this wealth. And then he continues, وَجَيِّدُ التَّدْبِيرِ لِلْمَعِيشَتِهِ, that he is someone who is prudent in his lifestyle. He is considerate and thoughtful of how he lives his life and where he invests his time and his value. And finally, he's يَلْسَعُ مِنْ جُحْرِ الْمَرَّتِينَ, and he's not someone who is inflicted or attacked, bitten twice from the same source. Now, this riwayah explains to us four critical attributes that we want to possess as mu'mineen. We want to be someone whose time and assistance is valuable and useful, someone who maintains a low expense and has limited attachment to this world, someone who lives their life with value and purpose, and someone who does not make the same mistake twice. In fulfilling or getting to these attributes of a mu'min, we find that the American culture has some attributes within it that we conflict with. For example, the American culture promotes a strong aspect of individualism. This individualism that is a part of this culture promotes the opinion of the person himself without the seeking of counsel of others or without benefiting from the experience of those who came before, and believes in the qualification of the individual to make his own decisions. One of the ways that we see this is that, for example, in children's programming, that they start the initiation into this culture from children. You'll find that many kids' programs are absent of parent figures, or that in decision-making processes amongst children, they're always teaching that you know better what's good for you than your parents. That your parents may promote one position, but you yourself know better because of you going through this, and this is your life, and you should decide how it's lived. This aspect of disassociating from previous generations or seeking counsel and validating your own strong opinion and your own strong aspect of personality is something we find that has ta'arud, that has some conflict with the Islamic principles of seeking advice and listening to the teachings that are given to us by our elders and benefiting from the experiences of elders. Which is why Hasan al-Ma'una is someone that is someone who has valuable assistance and has the ability to give nasiha and to receive nasiha. We see, for example, the statements of Amir al-Mu'mineen where he tells you that give your children counsel and assist them, but if they don't listen, then set them free. But the point is the significance of controlling the strong personality, of understanding that though my opinion is valid, I should benefit from those that came before me, is something that we need to correct within this culture, to modify so that it works with us and continues down with us. The second we take a look at is the strong approach to materialism or capitalism within the American culture that we have some conflict with. Islam is a religion that has never put the priority on material possession. And as a matter of fact, we see that materialism is something that the desires of this world are something that take us away from akhirah and distract us. And we see the attributes of a mu'min. Khafif al-ma'una is someone whose expenditures are light and less. Their attachment to this world is less. So we see, for example, the system of capitalism and materialism is something that this nation exports around the world. This culture exports. The promotion of buying new phones every year, new cars and new models every year, the chasing of greater and greater wealth, and the satisfaction of life being through a system of wealth, we find has some ta'arud and conflict with our faith in Islam. Therefore, we find that we need to modify this attribute within our children if they are to live this culture. The third area that we take a look at that we see some conflict, and this is not an absolute list, but this is to show that while there are a great number of benefits that we can extract from the culture that we live in, and we should, we also have to be conscientious of some of the alternate influences that disagree with our faith. So take from this culture, allow your children to benefit from the culture that they live in. La haraja fi, there's no harm in it. But be careful that as they take the good things from the culture, you ensure that those aspects that disagree with Islam can be reduced in their impact in our children. And that's where that third aspect comes in, is the absence of faith and spirituality as part of a culture. As a culture, our lifestyle puts more value and more interest in the wealth and possessions that we earn than the condition and the health of our spirit. The separation of church and state has created a culture here that is absent from the awareness or acknowledgement of Allah in our day-to-day lives and our performance. In the contemporary culture, we see further that through systems of education that remove the mention of Allah and attempt to disprove the presence of Allah, that the culture creates an environment that any association with spirituality and faith is considered to be a source of ignorance and unawareness of what the reality is that a person should be living in. And we know this to be in direct conflict with the teachings of Islam. So these become lessons for us to know that while this culture exists and we want our children to benefit from this culture, we have to keep some separation from the harmful aspects of this culture to create a different identity for our children that doesn't completely immerse them into this culture. Some of the practical ways of doing this, for example, one of the practical ways of creating that some separation, that the negative attributes of this culture don't permeate into our next generation, are, for example, one of the advices that are given to us by Ayatollah Sayyid Sistani, Hafidhahullah. One of the advices that many Westerners, when they go to see Sayyid Sistani, is that he tells you, preserve your native languages in your house. That this aspect of preserving your native language or your parents' language or your heritage language in your household, whether that be Farsi, Hindi, Swahili, Urdu, Gujarati, Kutchi, whatever that is that this preservation of this language creates an individual identity in the children that separates them from adopting all of the aspects of the culture they live in and creates for them a unique and individual identity. Another way that we go about and we preserve and we create a unique identity for our children, not to say that ignore everything that's in the culture, but that preserves our children from some of the aspects of the culture that we want to separate them from, is, for example, travel. And traveling to Makan al-Muqaddasa, to traveling to the ziyarat, traveling to Hajj, traveling for Umrah, traveling to visit other countries, traveling to our homelands that our parents are from and our places of heritage, or traveling in general, gives children a unique identity that allows them to see culture as not a unique monoform and monolith that they have to conform to, but rather that cultures vary from location to location, and that it's okay that they're different from all the people that they live with, because a unique identity established within them exists somewhere else around the world. Especially ziyarat. That create an identity and show a culture of faith of people who share your faith with you, gives a child confidence to create a unique identity and not absorb all culture that is imposed upon them. One of the things that I promote, especially amongst the young people, and I continue to promote it, is the ziyarat of Arba'in. In the ziyarat of Arba'in, a child, when they go take a look at a different country and they go to the country of Iraq, they see the characteristics of Shias from all over the world coinciding in one location. And they see the behavior of the Shias of giving and generous people. They see the love of Ahlul Bayt as a unifying character. They see the relationship between people and the mannerisms of how they interact, how they talk to each other, the consideration that they have. And they start to understand that if I am to be a Shia, the identity I want to conform to is not necessarily just the culture where I grow up and the environment I'm in, but rather this identity that has good character and akhlaq, regardless of the language that I speak. One of the unique attributes is that people from all cultures, when they come together in this location, there's no disregard for one over the other. There's no abuse of one nationality over the other, but rather the co-joining of all of these people with one interest and one faith. Very briefly, our third point that we take a look at, is there a benefit in preserving the faith of the culture of our forefathers? And is there a benefit in attaching ourselves to the culture that comes before us? Very briefly, one aspect of the benefit in preserving the culture that we come from, and that our forefathers come from, and that the previous generations come from, or that in cultures where Islam has been established for thousands of years, is that those cultures have a strong attachment and relationship to Islam. That a part of those cultures is the facilitating of the worship of Allah. For example, in a culture where everyone fasts in the month of Ramadan, it promotes the fasting in children and youth because they see everyone performing this action all together. In, for example, the aspects of even the performance of Salat al-Eid, we see the preservation of culture in a culture where Eid is present. It promotes the aspect of children fasting in the month of Ramadan and appreciating the days of Hajj. In a culture where, for example, Muharram is the norm and everyone observes Muharram together, we see that it promotes the children to worship, to remember and to worship Allah and to acknowledge the days of Muharram as part of the society as opposed to the individual effort. We can facilitate the process of our children worshiping Allah and following Allah by inculcating them to a culture that revolves around the practices and the dates of Islam. And this becomes something helpful to us. This becomes something that makes it easier for us to teach our children and our next generation to observe the sha'air of Allah, the signs of Allah. In the same way that, for example, we take a look and we see that one of the places where the lifestyle of Islam benefits us and makes it easier for us to maintain and to observe these days is if that culture preserves and continues, and especially in days like these, where we are absent from being able to go to our community centers, where we are absent from relying on the community to promote for us the commemoration and the memory of these days and their significance in the faith of Islam. If my household culture is attached to a culture that has the practice of observing Muharram in the house, I will have an easier time of teaching my children about that process as well too. And the conversation from here can shift into many different directions that talk about even the concept of marriage. And that the observance and the acknowledgement of our cultures that we come from is a facilitation in marriage. That if the two individuals that are getting married, the husband and wife, share a same culture, it makes it easier for them to come to an understanding and an expectation of what the home life will be like. You see, us having been raised in a particular culture in our households, if our spouse was raised in a similar culture, then the expectation of what the home will be like, what the time at home will be like, becomes easier for us. We can both share the burden in, for example, raising our children because our expectations of our children will be similar. In households where there are different cultures, it doesn't mean this is bad. It just means there's more work to be done. It's harder for the couples to go through the process of understanding where the similarities are and what the priorities are that need to be ensured that they're taught to children. And what the priorities are of how the household should be managed to make it comfortable for both spouses. So culture in itself is a benefit, is something that facilitates this process, especially in marriage where, for example, and I explain this to many people many times, that in marriage, the first 2 years are just getting to speak the same language, to understand each other, that to understand what does it mean when one person says this, what does it mean when another person says this. And then the next 5 years, you go through the process of understanding the details of each other's behavior, of how do I know that when someone comes home, they've had a bad day? How do I know when someone puts a cup down on the table that they're upset or they're happy? All of these aspects are taking time of the two personalities getting to know each other. And that in this process of getting to know each other, there's many periods of conflict and disagreement, not because anyone has evil intention for the other, but that we don't understand where the other person is coming from. And that culture is one of those vehicles that facilitates this. Not that it's not possible without it, but that it makes it easier to go through this process because we come from similar backgrounds that have similar traditions in our households, that we understand more so where each other is coming from. All of these aspects bring us to the conclusion that culture is something that exists as a lifestyle that doesn't disagree with Islam, but it always needs to be kept in sight that what does Islam want from me? And as long as my culture doesn't conflict with the demands of Islam, I have the permission to exercise and believe and dress it in that way, to eat in that way, to socialize in that way of my culture, and continue down the path of Islam. Tonight, we start to discuss the Masa'ib of Ali Muhammad. And the Masa'ib that we begin our discussion with are those of the mountain of patience, al-Masa'ib, Sayyidah Zainab Salamullahi alayha. In the Masa'ib of Sayyidah Zainab, we discuss many things, and we discuss many of the problems that she went through. But one of the places that we seldom spend much time on is the sacrifices that Sayyidah Zainab presented on the battlefield of Karbala. After the Shahadat of Aba Abdullah, we see all of the patience that she showed and all of the efforts that she exerted in the protection of the religion of Islam. But Sayyidah Zainab also exerted efforts and exerted patience like every woman did on the day of Ashura in the field of Karbala for the sake of Imam al-Hussein. Sayyidah Zainab also presented her two sons, Aun and Muhammad, for the sacrifice in protecting Aba Abdullah. When Sayyidah Zainab left Medina, she left her husband Abdullah ibn Ja'far. Abdullah ibn Ja'far was a pious man, the son of Ja'far al-Tayyar, who was known for his bravery, his wealth, his generosity, and his character. But because of injury, he was not, or because of disability or injury, he was not present with Imam Hussein in the Safar. But Sayyidah Zainab had stipulated in her marriage, she said, "Oh Abdullah, I agree to marry you, but if at any time this Hussein and I have never been separated, we've been together since we were children." Very famously, it was said that when Sayyidah Zainab was an infant and she would cry, to silence her, the only thing that would silence her was looking at the face of Aba Abdullah. Sayyidah Zainab said, "Oh Abdullah, my marriage to you is complete, but if my Hussein ever goes anywhere, I want to go with him. Please don't stop me from leaving him. If you can accept this condition, then I am married to you and our affair is settled." Abdullah said, "How can I separate Zainab from Hussein?" So when Imam Hussein's kafila, when Imam Hussein's caravan left the city of Medina, Sayyidah Zainab left with him, and from behind they said there is a rider coming who was Abdullah ibn Ja'far. Sayyidah Zainab, upon hearing that her husband Abdullah was coming, became worried that maybe Abdullah has changed his mind and he doesn't want me to go. And she prepares that, "Abdullah, don't stop me now. I cannot leave without Hussein. Hussein and I must be together." Abdullah says, "No, Zainab, I did not come to stop you. I came to bring you these two sons of ours. That take these two boys, Abdullah, Aun and Muhammad, and should you find Hussein in any difficulty, present one to protect Hussein from me and present one from yourself in the defense of Hussein ibn Ali." These two boys were prepared from the beginning to be presented on behalf of their parents in the love of Aba Abdullah. Which is why on the night of Ashura, all of the women were in their tents preparing for the next day and telling their sons and telling their brothers and telling their husbands that tomorrow Imam al-Hussein will be in danger. Ensure that you protect your Imam. They said that in the tent of Sayyidah Zainab, Abu Abdullah, when he passed, he heard the conversation of Zainab sitting and telling, "Oh Muhammad, you are the grandsons of Ja'far al-Tayyar, the great warrior of the religion of Islam, the one who attained shahadat in the battle of Mu'tah, the one who was granted by Allah wings in paradise for his bravery in the defense of Islam. And you are the grandsons of Ali ibn Abi Talib. You have the blood of great bravery on both of the sides, from your mother and from your father. Tomorrow, I want you to be amongst the first who present their sacrifice to protect your uncle Hussein. Don't let anyone precede you in creating a sacrifice for your uncle or not defending your uncle because of fear." The two sons say, "Oh mother, we assure you we will fight for our uncle. We will defend him with our lives." She says, "Oh my sons, but one thing, remember something. Tomorrow in the army, the way an army is arrayed is that it has its central body and then it has its right flank and left flank. On top of these, Omar Sa'ad had prepared the army to put 4,000 men in front of the river Furat, because Hussein and his family had been thirsty for 3 days. And he wanted to ensure that no one would take the water so that they would fight in a state of thirst and that the battle would be over quickly. His goal was to pressure Abu Abdullah. Sayyidah Zainab says, "Tomorrow, oh my children, when you fight, you have the blood of bravery in you. But understand something. If you attack the Furat, you can overcome 4,000 men. You have the blood of your grandfathers in you. You have the blood of Shuja'at. You have been trained by Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas to fight. I have no doubt in my blood that you can't overcome 4,000 men and to attack upon the water. But oh my children, remember something. Your uncle Hussein ibn Ali has been thirsty for 3 days. Asghar has been thirsty for 3 days. Sakina is thirsty for 3 days. I will not forgive you if you take water when your uncle is still thirsty. This is why they said the day of Ashura, after the companions had been spent, two young boys came to their uncle and said, "Uncle, give us permission, let us fight." Hussein ibn Ali, we imagine his throat. How did he allow the words to come out? "Oh, nephews, you are young boys. You were of the ages of 11 and 13 in some narrations." It said, "How can I send you in front of an army that is thirsty for our blood? Oh, children, you've been thirsty for 3 days. How shall I send you in front of soldiers? How will your mother be patient through this difficulty?" They said, "Uncle, it is mother who is sending us and will not be pleased with us until we present our sacrifice." Abu Abdullah goes to Zainab. She says, "Oh Zainab, what if Abdullah ibn Ja'far is displeased that his sons should be killed by enemies?" She says, "Oh Hussein, it was Abdullah who sent these boys for sacrifice for you." Imam al-Hussein eventually gave permission to these two boys, and they rode out into the battlefield together. And they rode out, and they said there was something unique about the fight of these boys, that as every soldier would cut in the direction of the army, the least pressure came from where Furat was running. So they would move in that direction first, and they would go in the direction of where there was least resistance. But they said these were two boys, whenever they would go into the battlefield, if they came close to Furat, we would see them turn back into the main body and to fight in the direction of the army and to stay away from the water. We can imagine these boys would say, "Oh, mother, look, we have been true to your word. We would not even approach the water. We'd sooner face the enemy than to face the Furat and face that embarrassment that we should approach the water when our uncle is thirsty." Eventually, these two brothers fell. They said one brother fell, the other was surrounded. He called out, "Brother, wait for me, I am following you." The two boys fell in the field of Karbala. From one side, Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas runs to remove the enemy. From the other side, Imam al-Hussein runs to remove the enemy. The two brothers bring the boys back to the tent. In narrations, it said that whenever a shaheed would be brought into the tents, the first one to be there would be Sayyidah Zainab, so that any woman who had lost her children, she was there to comfort them. Any woman who had lost her brother or her husband or her father, Sayyidah Zainab was the first one there to comfort the woman and to accept the sacrifice on behalf of Ahlul Bayt and say, "Oh lady, you have made a great sacrifice. I assure you, my mother Zahra will accept your sacrifice. She will be pleased what you have done for her son Hussein today." But they said when the bodies of Aun and Muhammad were brought, Zainab did not come. The women went looking, they did not see Zainab anywhere. Abu Abdullah himself went looking, "Where has my sister Zainab gone?" He finds Sayyidah Zainab alone in a tent, they say. He says, "Oh Zainab, come bid farewell to your boys." Zainab, she comes and she does not cry over her children. She does not weep for a moment. Rather, they said, we saw Zainab sit between the two boys, place her hands on the chest of her sons, and say, "Allah yataqabbal minna hada." "Oh Allah, accept this sacrifice from us." And Zainab then did not weep over her children. The day after Ashura, when the women were removed from the field of Karbala, every woman looked at her deceased laying in the field of Karbala and wept. They said that Sayyidah Zainab threw herself from the camel and went to Abu Abdullah and complained to him, "Oh Hussein, Zainab has never been without you. How shall Zainab leave you now?" They looked and they said that there were two bodies of young men that no woman looked at with tears. Was there no mother for them? Zainab was their mother, but Zainab was making sure that the message of Hussein and the sacrifice of Zahra's son was preserved, not her sacrifice. Even in Sham, when the heads of the Shuhada were returned, every head was accepted by one of the grieving women of that deceased. Some were the mothers, some were the sisters, some were the daughters. But there were two heads that they said were these orphans who fought for Hussein. And they called out, "No, their mother Zainab is alive, but Zainab weeps for Hussein, not for her sacrifice." They said that Sayyidah Zainab throughout the entire Waqia of Sham, throughout the entire Safar of Karbala, never once wept for her children until she returned to Medina. Upon entering the city, that she stayed with Imam Zainul Abidin until a time when Zainul Abidin himself said, "Oh, Auntie Zainab, it's time for you to return to your house." Sayyidah Zainab complained, "Oh, Sajjad, now after all of these trials, even you want to separate yourself from me?" Imam Zainul Abidin replied, "No, oh, Aunt Zainab, it's appropriate for you to return to your house." He took Sayyidah Zainab to her house. The description describes that the two, when they went to separate, they hugged one another and wept for the masa'ib that had crossed over them until Sayyidah Zainab entered the house that was now silent from the playing of children, was the silent from the calls of her sons. She saw the corner where the children would sleep. Sayyidah Zainab, now remembering her sons, tears came to her eyes. Again she sat between the two beds, put her hand on each bed. Oh, my sons, where has your mother left you? Oh, my children, how did your mother leave you alone in the wilderness and come back? إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون. ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين. وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون. ندعوك باسمك العظيم الأعظم الأعز الأجل الأكرم. With tears in your eyes in the memory of Sayyidah Zainab, raise your hands by her sacrifice. Ya Allah, 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 Ya Allah. يا الله بحق حسين وجده وأبيه وأمه وأخيه وتسعة المعصومين من ذريته. Oh Allah, accept this small ibadat from us. Ya Allah, forgive our sins and cover our flaws. Ya Allah, remove this disease and difficulty that prevents us from doing the azaa of Aba Abdullah the way we would like to. Oh Allah, give shafa'ah to the mu'mineen, the muslimin, and all of the people of the earth wherever they are from this sickness and from all sickness and disease. Ya Allah, fulfill the hajat of those who are gathered here and mentioned by the name of Ahlul Bayt and do remembrance of Aba Abdullah. Ya Allah, keep our children on the upright path of Ali Muhammad. Ya Allah, keep our lineage on the love of Islam and Ahlul Bayt. Ya Allah, hasten the reappearance of Sahib al-Zaman and make us from his upright supporters. Oh Allah, entitle us to the shafa of Aba Abdullah in dunya and in akhirah. رحم الله من يقرأ سورة الفاتحة مع الصلوات. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن